Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think that's my cue to officially get started. My computer says it's 62 degrees outside, so I'm excited. I hope all of us get out this afternoon. We're here today for a session called Journalism and Democracy, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And I am Martha King. I'm a senior program officer at the Charles H. Revson Foundation. The Revson Foundation is a founding member of GoVoteNYC, and I have the privilege of co-chairing GoVoteNYC alongside Sabrina Collazo of the New York Foundation and Eve Stotland of the New York Community Trust. I want to thank Neil Coleman, who's the director of GoVoteNYC, for leading our efforts and also organizing these public discussions. Just as background, since 2021, GoVoteNYC has brought together 16 donors who've contributed $4.8 million to support nonpartisan efforts that increase voter participation in New York City. The grantees of GoVoteNYC have shown that nonprofits who are trusted messengers in their communities can successfully inspire New Yorkers who haven't voted in the past to vote in higher numbers, often at double the rate of general turnout in this city. We also host public conversations like this on issues at the heart of civic participation and elections and democracy. And today's session examines the role of journalism and local journalism in particular in building democracy and civic engagement. And today, GoVoteNYC is so pleased to be co-hosting with the Lenfest Institute for Journalism and Shawn, who is the head of Philadelphia programs at Lenfest and also a panelist. Shawn, could you tell us a little bit about Lenfest to get started?
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for having us here and to allow us to be co-hosts of this really important workshop and panel. Lenfest Institute for Journalism is a journalism foundation that supports scalable solutions for local news. We were founded back in 2016 by Jerry Lenfest, who established the Institute as he purchased the Philadelphia Inquirer and set us up as the non-controlling owners of the Inquirer. But in addition to our support for the Inquirer, we also support the local Philadelphia ecosystem, which is the work that I oversee, and as well as looking for sustainable strategies across the country and supporting some of our national work as well as statewide work here in Pennsylvania. And we are really excited to partner and co-host this panel discussion, particularly looking at the issue of democracy and the intersection of local news and journalism. And think it particularly important, I'll talk a little bit more as we get into our discussion around the Every Voice, Every Vote initiative, which is a $4 million investment in this second phase that we are just in the process of launching now, of supporting both journalism organizations in Philadelphia and our surrounding counties and community organizations that are all in support of increasing civic engagement, shifting the conversation that our constituents are facing beyond just kind of the horse race and the candidates to really looking at the issues that are most critical to Philadelphia and Philadelphians and how we can ensure that our residents are actively accessing and attaining the information that they need and finding opportunities to participate in the political process.
Thanks, Shawn. And Revson is also a partner of Lenfest, so it's special for us as well. And I'm particularly excited to moderate today because for 15 years under Julie Sandorf's leadership, the Revson Foundation has invested more than $15 million in rebuilding and supporting New York City's local news sector. We recognize journalism as the lifeblood of civic infrastructure, of civic connection and community. It's a public good, it's a public service, and it's also a necessary piece of the puzzle for meeting any other philanthropic goal we might have. And of course, we need it to keep government responsive and accountable. So the plan for today is for me to ask some questions for about 30 minutes. Then one of GoVoteNYC's wonderful grantee partners, Sandra Choi of the Minkwon Center for Community Action, will bring their work into the conversation and ask the panelists a few additional questions, kicking off a broader conversation with all of you. So thank you, panelists, for joining us. Shawn Mooring, the head of Philadelphia programs at Lenfest, Mikhael Simmonds, who is the executive director of the Center for Community Media at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. And the center serves news organizations that provide essential local coverage for populations whose voices and issues are underrepresented in mainstream media. They also do incredible work among New York City's community and ethnic media sector. And last but definitely not least, Mazin Sidahmed is the executive director of Documented, the only nonprofit news site devoted solely to covering New York City's immigrants and the policies that affect their lives. And I hope that you can find their impressive bios in the chat, I think. So thank you all. You are each on this panel because you have unique approaches to strengthening civic participation via journalism. And so I'd like to hear from all of you, but first to start with Shawn and the perspective of Philadelphia and what Lenfest is doing there, we'd love to hear about your work vis-a-vis civic engagement and journalism.
Absolutely. And I mentioned it briefly in my intro. One of the major initiatives that Lenfest is engaged in right now is called Every Voice, Every Vote. And it was initially launched in 2023 as it related to our municipal elections as we were electing Philadelphia's 100th mayor. And because of the specific stipulation around how city council members, if they were choosing to run for mayor, we had an incumbent mayor who had been in office for 8 years, had several city council members opt to run. So we were at that junction in electing essentially almost half of city council had vacancies, as well as our 100th mayor. And so launched this initiative that was supporting both local news organizations and media, but also for the first time, Lenfest was investing in and supporting community organizations that were hosting town halls, partnering with media partners to host debates, and really looking at that as an opportunity to engage trusted messengers, because oftentimes we had communities that had disaffected relationships with media. So one wanted to ensure that we were creating opportunities in space for folks to engage and gain access to critical news and information as it related to the elections. And so we launched that with an initial investment of $1.8 million that went out and supported both news and media organizations and community organizations. We also worked with social media ambassadors. So these were social media influencers that partnered with us to share information about the events and the grants that were being distributed, as well as lift up articles and information, opportunities for engagement, whether it be town halls or debates and things of that nature, so that we were also shifting the conversation from the horse race of the candidates to really identifying and supporting the critical issues that were most important. We also funded and commissioned a public opinion poll as a part of this process, where we had an initial focus group of 58 Philadelphians that were of voting age from different communities that then informed the a larger poll that went out, a mailing poll that touched 1,200 Philadelphians that were able to kind of share with us what issues are most important, what are some potential solutions to those issues, and then also understanding how folks were engaging and getting their news and information as it related to the election. And so that was a really monumental event. We had over 130 partners, both funded and or pro bono partners. Every major broadcast or newspaper in the Philadelphia region was were partnering with us throughout this initiative. We had a reach of over 15 million people were touched or impacted by the Every Voice, Every Vote initiative, and whether it be articles, voter guides, or that we produced, and I think we had translated our articles and materials into over 13 languages that were, so to ensure that it was increasingly accessible, and had over 230 projects or events that were a part of this 18-month initiative initially. And as I said, we're in the process now, have applications open to do another 24 months of this initiative with a specific focus on civic engagement.
And such an incredible initiative that actually was part of the impetus for this entire panel. Mikhael, is there work at the Center for Community Media that you want to highlight for us on this issue?
Sure, but first, can you hear me clearly? I want to make sure I'm not breaking up. Well, okay, great. Yeah, so we at the center, we're doing our elections work focused on New York has two angles, two tactics. One is we have a mentorship cohort happening right now with about 14 newsrooms, 14 journalists, and we're helping them produce local election stories. So we're not just talking about the city overall, but we think about hyperlocal, or think about enclaves that may be across the city, but not in one place. For example, if you could say Chinese American communities in different boroughs, for example. So we're working with journalists currently to help them produce these stories. That we provided an editor, so to ease the load of the work for the specific newsroom. And we also have multiple sessions happening once a month, focused on different topics. These topics could range anything from as direct as reporting on local elections, what you should know, what you shouldn't know, to data reporting, to AI, for example. That's a session we're going to have coming up in a few months. To taking a step back and having sessions for publishers. How do you think about advertising? How do you think about the ethics of advertising and things of that nature at this time? So we see our role here as supporting the editorial work. Can you raise the quality and breadth of this work to get to the communities that need it the most? Because the journalists know the needs of the community. They know where the gaps are. We're just here to give them the space and resources to do what they know how to do already.
So, Mazin, you have a different perspective on this as one publisher and one outlet. I mean, you've experienced obviously from many other places, but from the perspective of documented, how are you considering or addressing civic
stop by when you
participation
get
in your
back? I have a quick question. On your way back, stop by. I have a quick question.
Sorry. Are we muted? Yes. Oh, now we're muted.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So yes, absolutely. We take a broad lens on the concept of civic engagement. We really want to help New Yorkers, immigrant New Yorkers, feel more connected to the city, more engaged with the city, more engaged with the city's government services and all the different things that the city has to offer. So the way we approach journalism generally is a little bit different. So as a news site, we're really dedicated to serving low-wage immigrants in New York, specifically Spanish speakers, Chinese speakers, non-Spanish speaking Caribbean New Yorkers. And the way that we try and serve those communities is by actually asking people what kind of news and information they would want, where they're getting their news and information, and then building products and coverage related to those information needs. So a lot of the things that we hear from people when we go out and do surveys and information needs assessments is that they want a better understanding of how to navigate New York City's resources, how to navigate all the different things that New York City has created to actually serve these communities and help them live more full and engaged lives. So we end up creating a lot of guides and resources, explanations of how to navigate these government resources that we publish on our site. It's kind of like a service journalism that we're really dedicated to. So in response to an information needs assessment that we did of Spanish-speaking New Yorkers, we created a WhatsApp news service about 5 years ago now. And we get over 100 messages a day from folks really trying to understand different things about, how to access healthcare, how to navigate the education system, how to get their kids more involved in different activities. And in response to these questions, we publish a lot of guides and resources on our site to really help people understand the civic infrastructure of New York City and feel more connected and engaged to their neighbors and the things that they can do in New York. So that's how we think about community engagement and civic engagement. But I can speak more a bit later about things that we're doing specifically tied to elections as well.
Okay, that's great. And Shawn and Mikhael, you both raised the issue of election coverage, talking about sort of the challenges of horse race type of coverage of elections. And in New York City, we know from surveys that New Yorkers who don't vote report that they feel uninformed about candidates. They feel uninformed about the offices on the ballot and how those offices impact their lives. And Mikhael, you in particular talked about raising the quality of this type of election coverage. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what's going well or not so well in terms of election coverage these days.
Thank you, Martha. Yeah, that's one of those questions where I feel like when we give the answer, we're going to wait until November and see the outcome. I feel hopeful about the type of engagement coming out of newsrooms, in the sense that within our lifetime, we talked about low engagement and low voter turnout. The mere fact that specific conversations are happening, not just for the mayor, but we're talking about school board, we're talking about pricing, congestion pricing, all of that is part of democracy, So the mere fact that all of these conversations are part of specific communities' everyday dialogue, I'd say that as a positive thing, as opposed to it going past. That being said, not to be a Debbie Downer, it's not equal, right? It's some communities that do not have that information have it now, and others don't. So the positive, what I feel positive about is just the idea that I'm seeing much more conversation that's beyond just the election, but about the other voting aspects that need to happen. And I feel I put an asterisk on that, recognizing that it's not equitably distributed across communities, however you define communities.
Shawn or Mazin, if you want to add on, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing I'll add, I think it's definitely about understanding how we are providing critical information to communities so that folks can make informed decisions. And, that was really one of the critical things that we sought to do with Every Voice, Every Vote, which was to make sure that no matter where folks were, whether you were from a community that has a strong tradition of turning out and voting, that their voices were heard, because oftentimes what you see with elections is that the communities that show up at the polls are the communities that get their streets shoveled, get their trash collected, but that doesn't mean that it's not an issue for the folks in X neighborhood that doesn't have a tradition of showing up. So one of the things that we really sought to do was make sure that we were partnering with community organizations and making sure that the voice of folks in non-traditional voting neighborhoods were hosting forums, so that they were inviting candidates to come into their communities and pay attention and hear from their constituents. And once you get a significant number of folks there, then the candidates have to show up, right? Because they don't want to be the one that didn't show up for this community. And to the extent that folks were actually complaining a little bit, right? But it also allowed us to, in many ways, level the playing field, where we had a couple of multi-million-dollar, self-financed candidates that could afford to buy up as much airtime as they needed or wanted to. But when it came down to town halls, forums, we're enforcing folks to come in and show up in communities. And that was, I think, one of the major wins with Every Voice, Every Vote, and the way that we approached that, to ensure that all communities' voices were heard, and were able to get their issues kind of out front and center.
Yeah, I just would, yeah, I agree with both those points, and I would just add that I think there is a real understanding now in the journalism industry that horse race coverage is not sufficient. That the way that folks have been covering news or covering elections over these past, 100 years, you could say, that is really not serving readers in the way that we need to serve readers. So I'd say that's a good thing. Generally, that journalists in big news organizations and small news organizations are really reckoning with their responsibility in democracy, the role that media plays within the process of people voting and picking the next president or local elected officials. And people feel a great weight of responsibility today in this year around, the rise of misinformation and the polarization that we're experiencing across the country right now. Journalists really understand that as an industry, they play a big role in that. So I think that's a really good thing. And there's some really interesting conversations happening across the industry right now that I think are really positive. But how do we move beyond horse race coverage? And I think that's the question that's still being decided. And as Shawn and Mikhael mentioned, I think it's going to look differently at large organizations, at small organizations, at community-based organizations. At Documented, we're actually trying to poll our readers and let the community lead on what they think we should be covering. So we did a poll of our readers on WeChat to understand what they would want to know in this election year, what kind of things they want to know from the folks who are running in the primary or what have you. And using that information to decide on what kind of stories we write and also what kind of questions we ask elected officials, creating guides and voter guides around the issues that voters actually care about the most, but also kind of holding people accountable on the issues that that readers care about the most.
You all have sort of started to get at this issue in terms of obviously engaging readers. And we know that people who consume news are more likely to vote. Part of why we're having this conversation, why journalism and democracy are so intertwined. But it seems that consumption of news is falling. And so if this is a problem, if we do believe that news consumption is going down or in different ways for different communities, Shawn, how might we persuade people to care more about the news and to consume more news?
Well, and I think, part of the issue is, so one of the things that I think that was critically important and that we paid a lot of attention to with the first phase of Every Voice, Every Vote is, well, what happened with voter turnout? I mean, there's no denying that Philadelphians that were voting in this last electoral, process had more information than they've ever had in a particular process, just given the ways in which we were able to really support the flooding of the zone with all types of information and access in all communities. But when we looked at the voter turnout numbers, they were about the same as the previous cycle. And I don't see that necessarily as a failure, because I think what our goal was to ensure that everyone had the opportunity to be informed. And we also were very cognizant of the fact that, how people consume the news, right? We're the non-controlling owners of the Philadelphia Inquirer, but the Philadelphia Inquirer doesn't necessarily meet the needs or serve every community equally in Philadelphia, not because there's not a desire to, but how people feel connected to news outlets and where they access information, I think is critically important. And so part of our process with Every Voice, Every Vote is we also engaged with 57 hyper-local media influencers, so social media influencers, so people who had TikTok, Instagram, Facebook presence, and were able to provide links to, media stories. We were able to provide and publicize town hall forums. We did opinion polling based on the research and the data that was made available. So I think part of it is also meeting people where they are, and because people aren't necessarily consuming traditional news, but they are going on TikTok, they are on social media. So how can we meet folks where they are to make sure that they have the same access to the information that they would as if they picked up a newspaper. And so making sure that there's credible, reliable access to those news sources and that information in the spaces that people are populating, I think is critically important.
Mikhael, do you want to speak more about meeting people where they are? Is there work that the center or the outlets involved with the center are doing on this?
Yeah, when we talk with newsrooms, we really say be the town square, not just the town crier. Let people be able to come to you and be in community with you on like a Tuesday. like that something drastic or crazy doesn't necessarily have to be happening. What we see with a lot of community and ethnic media is that they are part of the community already. So they're deeply connected and deeply involved. Where their limitations kick in, maybe a generational limitation, as in they're part of a subsection of a community. No community is one monolith in and of itself. Or if you're thinking about different immigrant groups, the reason and the wave of the immigration also changes that community dynamic. So what we ask, or what we try to work with newsrooms on when it comes to engagement, is, hey, how do you engage with other parts of the community you're already in? You're not there to cover the entire city. That's not your goal. But if you are covering, say, the Caribbean American community, or Chinese American community, or Indian American community, you may have deep roots in the population that has been there for 40 years, 30 years, but those who came for university in the last 15 are not part of your world. How do you get involved in that space? And how do you think about that with the limited resources you have? The fortunate thing about elections is that it's a good excuse to really step out and try something new, while understanding that your audiences may feel bombarded by this information while saying they don't have information they want. It's a very interesting simultaneous thing that is happening. What we've seen so far is gatherings at people's newsrooms, or gatherings at community locations, or partnerships with community organizations. We have seen conversations on social media. That's also limited because, again, depending on the community, depending on who you're trying to reach. We've seen social chat apps, WhatsApp, as Mazin mentioned, as just a way to reach out to different groups, and each has its strength and its limitation. And I would say when you're really dealing with community and ethnic media as well, the conversation about elections is not just the US, it's their home country. So the conversation didn't just start for 2024, even if the elections in their home countries in 2024. Both conversations are happening simultaneously. And if your institution or your outlet is only having the American conversation, which is important, you need to have it, and you're ignoring the home country conversation, depending on the nature of the dynamics and the political space of the home country, because we could go into by country, you are actually not engaging your audience in the way they want to be engaged. You're engaging them in the way you want to engage them, and those are two very different things.
Mazin, Documented did fantastic research before launching your verticals focused on West Indian community and Chinese American community here in New York. And I know that research did uncover some of the reasons why people do want to consume news and why they might not. And I'm wondering if there's lessons from that research that you want to share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to zoom out, I think the issue of news consumption falling is really impacting the sector massively. I think you mentioned that there's a few studies already that show that news consumption definitely is falling precipitously. And the reasons kind of on a broader macro level are varied around burnout, news around the pandemic, news of the previous administration. So many different things have kind of been driving that, and it's affecting the business of news. So we've seen a real bloodbath across the industry of newspapers and large organizations, small organizations shuttering because of a lack of engagement, and obviously that drives revenue. And the news industry has been having a crisis already for some time. So this is really a huge reckoning. I think some people have called this like an apocalyptic moment in the industry, as far as how much difficulty the business of journalism is in right now, and news avoidance is a big part of that. But for the communities that we serve, there's always been a lack of trust and interest in the news ecosystem. And the research, we've done like 3 or 4 big sets of research. The one you're referencing last year specifically focused on the Chinese and West Indian communities, kind of reiterated some of the things that we'd heard from Spanish-speaking communities, which is that, number one, when most people engage with the news, they find that their community is either covered as victims or criminals. There's no nuance or in between in the ways in which they're reflected in the coverage. People aren't shown in positive light, in complicated lights. The nuances of the communities that they understand and the way that they see themselves, they don't see that portrayed in most media coverage whenever people from their community are highlighted. So that's one of the main reasons we decided to approach things slightly differently. And people have a real desire and interest in actionable information that they can actually use to make decisions in their day-to-day lives. And this is actually quite similar when you look at other larger publications like the New York Times and other places. You often find that the most read articles on those sites are articles about how to live a better life, how to be more productive, how to improve in your work-life balance, things of that nature, that a lot of people just generally gravitate towards that type of coverage. And low-wage immigrant communities are no different. They want information that can actually help them, live more full and engaged lives. And then there are specific topic areas that are actually quite unique to each individual community. So I think the main thing that Chinese immigrant communities told us they were interested in was news about public safety. This is more of a recent trend, I think, because of the hate crimes that were happening during the pandemic, especially, and have continued on since. But there's just a real, genuine interest and concern from that community around issues around public safety. West Indian community said they wanted more positive representations of the community in the media. They wanted to see members of the community who were doing good things uplifted and highlighted. So really trying to be specific and responsive to individual community needs is super important if you want to build that trust back. Because I think the way to fight this news avoidance is to build trust and really have people feel that the community, the media is actually serving them, as opposed to, I think a lot of people feel that it's serving a larger interest, an interest that doesn't actually align with their interests. So how can you kind of change that relationship and that perspective? And we see it on WhatsApp. It's a real person. We have a dedicated community correspondent, Ramel, who is replying to people's questions on WhatsApp. People know him by his first name. And I think that changes people's relationship with the site as a whole. It goes from being the media to Ramel, like an actual person that they have a relationship. He calls it it's like having a journalist in your pocket. You can just message them and ask them a question. And I think trying to get that at scale is going to be the real challenge for media.
And do you see that in your reader numbers in terms of like different stories that are most read or consumed at Documented?
Definitely. I think so. Before, the reason we embarked on this research initially is that, when we started the site, the goal was really to make sure that the readers at the center of the stories, the people at the center of the stories were also the people reading the stories. A lot of immigration coverage, is about immigrant communities, but it's not actually for immigrant communities. You're writing about a community for a non-immigrant community, a non-immigrant audience, I should say. So that's why when we started out, we were kind of doing journalism in the way, this top-down approach that we'd always done it. And we were translating our stories into Spanish and not seeing a readership for those Spanish versions of stories, whereas the English version was having an impact. When we actually asked the community, what do you want from us as journalists? What do you actually want from us as a news organization? And started publishing journalism in Spanish that was responsive to those needs, our Spanish stories became consistently the most read stories on our site. So when you actually ask people what they want, there's a business case for it additionally, in that it does actually drive readership and audience at the same time. So I think being responsive to information needs is not just something that's nice to do and important. It's actually, I think, good for the viability of your organization.
Thanks. And I want to bring Sandra in a moment, but before we go there, I know we've talked a little bit both about sort of the apocalyptic context that the news industry is in right now, but you all have also talked about a lot of positive work that's happening. And I'm wondering if you could just highlight one thing that you think all of us on this call should really be excited about and looking forward to when it comes to journalism and civic engagement. Go ahead, Shawn.
Definitely one thing that brings me hope is just also hearing the echoing, right, of the centering of community and being responsive to what community needs. I was just sitting here nodding along with Mazin as he was talking, because it's not about just, doing the local news and information, needs assessment, but then what's the response to that assessment? How are you changing what you're doing to better meet the needs of the people that you're trying to serve? And when we think about news as a public good, it's about meeting the needs of the constituency. And I'm hearing that more and more often from newsrooms and from media makers, and the notion of meeting people where they are. And that's not about lowering journalistic standards, but it is about being responsive and responsible to the communities that we're seeking to serve and inform.
Yeah, to build off of that, I would say two things. Over the years, I've seen better feedback loops with newsrooms and the communities, whatever structure that is. I've seen better, not perfect, but better. And I think they will continue to get better over time. And the other one is a kind of like side program we have at CCM, which is where we have three verticals. One is a Latino Media Initiative, a PI Media Initiative, and Black Media Initiative. And we've really been trying to break down those silos so publishers would talk with each other, because we mostly with publishers. So in an election year when everything is even more divisive, when everything is more like black or white, I think it's really good to say, all right, there's a publisher from a different community I could just run something by, or editor I could just run something by. Because what has happened, and it happens in mainstream media, it happens in any type of media, quite frankly, you can't end up falling into biases or dog whistling language or things of that nature, when in truth, and just like not even out of like a moral stance, you just don't know, right? Or you're just on the grind. But it's always good to have a peer you can run something by in a safe space before you produce a project or before you produce a piece of journalism. So we hope that we see better journalism across communities about each other on these topics as we move forward, because the most vulnerable communities are fighting the exact same problems. They're just divided because of the structures they have. Talk about gentrification, clean air, heat, and cooling in the city. We could go on and on and on. I can name 10 neighborhoods that have, quote unquote, nothing to do with each other. And the same policies and the same developers and the same structures are affecting them exactly the same way. So having that conversation is super helpful for them to organize in their reporting, but also not to write in such a way or produce journalism in such a way that demonizes or makes someone else feel like the enemy inadvertently.
Yeah, those are both amazing. I'll probably have to say the same thing as Shawn. Actually, I feel that there is a real culture shift happening in journalism right now, which is really exciting. People are questioning all of the kind of fundamental things that we've done as an industry, and really reevaluating them and asking ourselves, what do we need to keep and what can we potentially change? And it's happening, obviously, in this kind of burgeoning nonprofit news movement that's building around the country and in New York specifically as well, but also at large institutions that have been around for over a century. They're really kind of shaking at their core and asking themselves, how can they be different in response to the fact that the industry is really suffering and kind of going through a difficult moment. I think it's allowed people to really experiment and do things that they probably wouldn't have done if they were thriving. So that has been, for me, from the outside looking in, from me from the outside of the kind of larger institutions, to see them making those changes has shown me that there is something really in the water right now that's shifting things in a pretty fundamental way that I hope will benefit democracy and major cities like New York around the country.
Thank you all. And I'm so pleasantly surprised. We didn't even plan to have so much synergy and so much sort of overlap in where this conversation was going to go today. And I think it leads well into the next part of this conversation, where I want to invite Sandra Choi, who is the Civic Participation Director at the Minkwon Center for Community Action, and also a GoVoteNYC partner, to join us. I'm so excited. Sandra, thank you for joining us. Minkwon convenes the very successful APA Voice Coalition, which is elevating civic participation among Asian Americans in the city. Asian Americans are the fastest growing community and population at the national, state, and city levels. And the coalition is reaching more than 200,000 voters every year. And so, Sandra, so happy you're here, and would love to hear about what Minkwon is doing, what you're doing with journalism and journalists to increase civic participation.
Yeah, thank you, Martha, for that introduction. I also just want to add, our coalition is celebrating 10 years of organizing together this year, including 2 redistricting cycles. So just using that base of experience and knowledge of bringing together all of our partners, listening to the speakers, our panelists speak today about their work, I couldn't help reflecting on our own experience doing outreach, electoral engagement outreach in New York City for Asian American communities. And some points that I just want to highlight is I was really excited to hear all of the panelists speak about their commitment to engaging diverse communities, centering language and immigration justice. Another point is that we cannot know one organization. We cannot be everything to everyone, and highlighting the value of partnerships. That's why Minkwon convenes almost 20 organizations to do this work. And another point is just, voter engagement is an art, not a science. We really have to be creative in how we talk to our members, how we present information. For us at APA Voice, we typically, every election year, we work together. We use different tactics to inform and engage our base. So things like town halls, public polls, mailers, and just being a trusted entity to deliver and share information is crucial to lead this work. And then just finally, one point I want to make is, really centering our community when we develop and create content. I think that's also really important. For us, when we do, New York is one of the largest immigrant communities, if not the largest, on the East Coast. It's a gateway to communities. Many immigrants come here first. And for us, when we are doing our work, sometimes there is no template for us to look at when we engage our base. So we give ourselves license to be more creative and deploy new strategies. And we're really heartened that a lot of other communities across the country sometimes approach us about how we do this work, and we share that knowledge with them as well. So things like ranked choice voting in 2021, New York City was the largest city to implement that. And we've had other communities across the country ask about how we've done this work. And we're really, we're just grateful to be this center of knowledge that we can be a national resource. So some of the other questions that I'd like to share with our panelists today, as they were talking about their work leading election outreach to raise voter participation rates, is that first is, we know 2024 is a presidential election year, and this will typically attract some of the highest voter participation rates here in New York. And we know that voter participation rates in New York elections vary widely. Turnout is impacted by the competitiveness of a race, access to information, and how or if voters are engaged by campaigns and by other civic agencies. It's also impacted by demographics such as age, access to voting methods, and income levels. So I'd like to ask our panelists, how do you prioritize your resources to which campaigns and election information are highlighted for your audience. Are there important media strategies that civic organizations should consider, so we can also highlight critical down ballot races and measures for our communities to participate in? And the second question I'd like to ask our panelists is, we know that community-led ethnic media outlets are a critical lifeline for first-generation immigrants and limited English proficient communities across the city. They rely on this for information that informs their political decisions and connection to our democracy. However, we're seeing more and more outlets with declining resources to provide this type of news coverage for a population, that really, they may have no other resources to approach if these resources go away. So what can an APA Voice, our coalition, to combat this, we are going to host a series of media roundtables and provide an overview of the Asian American voter base, noteworthy voter participation trends, and races that we'll be focusing on in 2024, so we can be a bridge for this work. So the question is, what can be done to ensure communities, especially limited English proficient communities, immigrant communities, have the news coverage, resources that they need to participate in our political process?
Sure, I'll get us started. So one, thank you for the work that you do and for the questions that you raised. I think one, you are 100% absolutely correct that we need to continue to invest and be, I think, move with intention as it relates to how we're engaging and supporting non-English speaking communities and our immigrant communities in terms of being a part of the political process. And so one, as I shared earlier, we were very intentional about including and reaching ethnic media as a part of, kind of the intentional populations that we were seeking to impact and influence, and not influence, but to inform, throughout the Every Voice, Every Vote initiative. But even as it relates to our ecosystem grant-making strategy with the Lenfest Institute, we also support our ethnic journalism affinity groups. So and National Association for Black Journalists, National Association for Hispanic, National Association for Hispanic Journalists, as well as Asian American Pacific Islander and our LGBTQ affinity groups. And I think, just in terms of making sure that those organizations are supported because of how they then support, and whether it be through capacity building initiatives, training initiatives, or resources, are ethnic-based media in Philadelphia. And so I think, having, from a funder perspective, having relationships with those affinity groups and also being very intentional about how we are engaging and supporting organizations that are a part of our election initiatives. Because one of the things that we're trying to shift is a focus around the horse race, approach to election coverage, and really being able to focus on the issues that are impacting communities and hearing from those communities about and creating opportunities for them to both engage in their native language. So translation services are critically important to make sure that, things are accessible for them to engage in the process and be completely informed.
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions and your work, Sandra. I really appreciate that. So yeah, I think as on your first question of how do you get news organizations like ours to cover the issues that you think the community needs to hear about, like get the information out to folks. I think it's really a matter of relationship building over time. I think there's a genuine interest from news organizations to cover the issues that you're related to, especially down ballot races. I've been a part of conversations with other nonprofit newsrooms where there's conversations of like, how can we cover down ballot races or other issues in a way that's compelling to readers? How can we present this information in a way, get this information out in a way that readers will actually engage with and want to read? Because I think one of the issues that folks, the disconnect, I think, for folks who are kind of in the non-journalism sector, who are trying to engage journalists, is just really understanding what the motivation for journalists are. Just want to publish things that readers actually want to read. I think that's really what it boils down to. Folks want to, there's an understanding that there's information that people need, and there's sometimes a delta between that and what they actually want to consume. So how can you bridge that gap and get people engaged in things that are important for democracy, or issues that are really important that a reporter has spent a long time investigating? I've had a nickel for every time a reporter spent a year investigating something that was really compelling and complex, and then they publish it and nobody reads it and they're just devastated. I think that happens to reporters all the time. So reporters understand that there are things that folks need to know, but sometimes they don't want to read. So really trying to get involved in that conversation with them of like, this is how you can connect with your readers about this. This is why this is important. This is why people would want to read about this. Or here's a way that we can get it out to folks. Another thing that we've done that a lot of news organizations are really more open to now is events. We've partnered with Make the Road and other organizations on events where we get information out to our readers that they'd want to know. So, earlier on in the pandemic, we did an event on, what your rights are if you get laid off from your job and you're undocumented. We were getting a lot of questions about that. So we brought labor lawyers in from Make the Road, and we had a Facebook Live event where people from our WhatsApp were able to ask questions, and it was really useful information for our readers. And it was a really great way for Make the Road to get its information out there for folks. So I think that that's something that I think a lot of news organizations will be more open to now than they might have been previously. And that's another way I think folks can really get connected. On your piece around ethics and community media, the Medill did a research study recently. They do this, I think it's annual, on the kind of state of local news across the country. And it's every year it's progressively worse. But for ethnic and community media, the problem is acute. It's really, it's even worse than the kind of, general, massacre we're seeing across the country of local news outlets. Ethnic and community media are really struggling. So it's a really important point that you raise. And I think that, one of the things that we do a lot is partner with ethnic and community media to get different stories out there and help kind of expand the reach of our stories and their stories. But the problem is really, really difficult. I think it's a problem that everybody in the industry is experiencing, regardless of, what readers they serve and, what income they have. It's just, making money out of news is really difficult. And it's a problem that I think will continue in the foreseeable future. But I imagine Mikhael has more to add on that.
Thank you, Mazin and Shawn, and thanks for your question, Sandra. Yeah, when I was musing on the answers, and I feel like I could just combine both questions, because in many ways they're tackling the same thing. But direct answers would be, you can work with us. We often do sessions where we just demystify a topic. What is happening in this space? Who are the players? What is the dynamic of the policy or of the environment? And that helps journalists, right? Just in thinking about what are the barriers to producing journalism. One is just figuring out what's happening or what's supposed to happen. So removing that barrier or making that easy, whether it be through a session or connecting with you directly, makes life a lot easier for the production of journalism. Be specific about your ask. Many times, a lot of nonprofits who do great work, they're like, housing, and just drop all of housing on a newsroom. And it's like, there's so many aspects of it. Being specific is super helpful. Again, thinking about making life easier for the actual journalist or the editor. Connecting journalists with experts. Just saying, hey, this is coming up. These are 5 experts you could talk to that understands your community and the intersection of the topic you're talking about. That makes, again, thinking about just the journalist's life and the priority of what gets chosen to be reported on is what's important, what people are interested in, and what you can do. And the connecting with the experts is helpful with the what you can do part. helping translate is helpful as well too. Obviously, in a place like New York, you have so many languages, so you can't do that for everyone. So looking at a specific outlet for the area or the community you're looking at and offering that service may be helpful, but they may not need it if they're already serving the community. But it may be something to think about in spaces where you have smaller groups within larger groups, right? So if you have the larger country language may well be served, but people who speak a minority language from that country may not be served, for example, in that space. Helping with explainers. We talked about elections, we talked about down ballot races, just an explainer about how to do things and helping or collaborating with them to produce that explainer for their audience is also super helpful. Mazin and Shawn talked about that. What does the community need to know? And that's so helpful in filling the gap in that sense. So those would be my like my actionable suggestions. Just think, if you know any journalists, have a conversation with them and see where the pain points are and fill that pain point to make their life easier. It doesn't take away from all the things Mazin said and Shawn said that may be very real barriers with what the community wants to know and need to know, but in the production of that work, that makes such a big difference.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to our panelists for sharing all those thoughtful responses. As organizations that lead civic engagement outreach on the ground, I think it's really important that we, work and collaborate with organizations that also do this work on the other side. And hopefully this year for this for this general election in 2024, we can work with some of our new friends here. So thank you to GoVote for organizing this important panel. I'm going to pass it over to Martha.
Thank you. I'm feeling New York is a small town right now. So I want to open it up and hear from all of you on the call. I see many familiar faces who know much more about these issues than I do. So I think we can go wild and unmute ourselves if you have a question, or you could put it in the chat. I'll give you a moment to think about it. I can't see everyone, so.
Martha, I'll start.
Thank you. Is that Julie?
I'm Julie Sandorf, president of the Revson Foundation. Shawn, what Lenfest and all your partners have done in Philadelphia is incredibly impressive. Probably, at least from what I can tell, the gold standard of bringing together everyone to engage in the mayoral election. I'm curious to hear, because I do think voter turnout and increase, certainly in New York, where voter turnout in the Bronx is hovering at 7%, and in the the highest districts, it's around 37%. I'm curious to hear, would there be anything you would have done differently to increase voter turnout? Is this just a function of building muscle over time in communities? What are the sticking points, and how can they get unstuck?
Yeah, so one thing that I would definitely lift up, because of course this was a, significant question, as it related to this turnout, and I mean, as it related to this initiative around voter turnout. And my, kind of knee-jerk reaction and response is that, getting voter turnout to the extent that, you're getting 7%, I mean, I think it hovers around 19 or so percent here in Philadelphia, it's not an overnight issue. And similarly, my background is not journalism, it's philanthropy and social justice, work from a nonprofit. These issues are issues that we've been, combating and, investing in for, hundreds of, definitely decades. And none of it is, snap your finger and you put in $1 million and it's going to change overnight. I think if there's no way that you could say this wasn't the most informed or, accessible information in a municipal race that Philadelphia has experienced. But the issues and I think the issues that underlie a decline in voter turnout are, very expansive, right? It's weather, it's, just years of feeling disaffected. And in some cases, I think having access to all of the information could be overwhelming, right? It could turn people off and say, I don't like any of these people, right? So I'm not going to go, right? But should we then not give them the information that's required and needed? No, I think this is the right approach. So I wouldn't necessarily change our approach. But I think we have to level set our expectations as it relates to voter turnout, because I think it's like many of the issues that we're facing, it's shifting culture, it's shifting behavior. And some of these things are very ingrained, right? And so to shift that and to see something different, I think takes time. I'll be interested to see now that we, at the end of this cycle, we'll be 4 years in, we'll have gone through 2, election cycles. And my hope is that we'll see an uptick. But again, I'm not resting everything on that particular measure.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? The level of investment, coordination, logistics of what every voice, every vote, I think maybe I screwed that up, every vote, every voice, is really extraordinary. And just curious if you could spend a minute on, like, what was the center of gravity? Who led the campaign? How was it done? What did it take to do? Because it's really, it stands out from anything that I've known.
Yeah, so the Every Voice, Every Vote initiative was born out of, I think it was the next mayor effort. So it wasn't the first time that investment in journalism around elections has been done in Philadelphia, but it definitely was our approach to this. And our anchor funder in this effort was the William Penn Foundation. That provided the lion's share, but we also got investment from several other funders, including Knight, Comcast is a supporter this time, as well as some others. But what the anchor for us was around accessibility. I think this was the first time where we engaged community organizations, and so Lenfest, of course, we're a media support organization, hadn't funded nonprofits, community-based organizations in the past, but really looking at it with the lens of, oftentimes these folks are the trusted messengers in communities. They're providing food, they're providing after-school programs. They have the community's interests at heart, and some of these communities feel very disaffected from journalism organizations. They feel, and I think Mazin touched on this at one point, they feel that these organizations are talking about them versus telling their stories or reporting what's happening in those communities. And so through this effort, what we really sought to do was level the playing field and create an opportunity for both communities and news media to sit on equal ground and create opportunities for collaborations. We were not forcing collaborations. We didn't direct, you work with this person and you work with this community, but created opportunities for folks to collaborate where it felt very natural, where it felt organic. And that was, I think, one of the really key components of this. It was extremely inclusive. It was, the collaborations were organic and really developed kind of from the bottom up. That allowed for, I think, this really unprecedented, model for collaboration. I also saw in the chat, someone asked about the issues that arose out of the public opinion poll. And so the issues that the priorities based on our polling was number one was public safety, education, economic opportunities, affordable housing, and homelessness. And one of the things that was really exciting is as we look now in the Parker administration, and when they put out their 100-day report and kind of the issues that they're focusing on, it's public safety, education, economic opportunities, and cleaning and greening Philadelphia. So a lot of those issues overlap. And so one of the things that we're really focused on in this next phase that we're launching now is accountability, but it's also engagement. What does it look like now that we see that the issues that were most important to Philadelphians are also the priorities for the administration? What are the policies? What are the opportunities for communities to influence, impact, stay abreast of those policies, and what role can communities play from a civic participation beyond just accountability? So it's accountability on both sides, right? From the community perspective, the governmental, municipal perspective, as well as media, in covering and staying abreast and informing folks on these issues.
Thanks.
Thanks, Julie. And Louisa, for your question as well. Others? Alyssa, I see you. Please.
Hi, everyone. Good morning.
Good
I
morning.
wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists. This was absolutely fantastic, and it was incredibly interesting to talk about how civics plays a role in our journalism. Something I wanted to ask, I know that all of our panelists mentioned doing work to really respond to the interests of the community, and I assume that was through polling or sometimes asking the questions, asking community members what they would like to know. So I'd love to know a little bit more about what that process is like, because it's something that we are interested in doing over at El Puente.
Great, I can start. I think all of our organizations do this. So I can definitely start. So there's we follow what's called, like in our space, an information needs assessment, which I imagine is pretty common in a lot of other sectors of the folks on this call work in. But there's a group out of Internews called the Listening Post Collective that actually has like a playbook on how to do community listening and really understand people's information needs. And it really involves, starting out with the kind of broad macro data that you have available to you, census data, like local, 311 data even. There's an amazing outfit in Detroit called Outlier Media that actually maps out a lot of people's information needs based off of what the number one, like 311 calls are in different zip codes and things of that nature. So really trying to understand what people are complaining about, what kind of issues people are seeing surface. So really starting out with that kind of macro data, then really mapping out, who is it that you want to understand the information needs of, and being super specific about that, figuring out where those people are, and then going out and designing like a pretty robust survey of the kind of things that you want to understand, and working with people who have genuine relationships in the community. So, really hiring people. So we hire people who have genuine community ties, speak the languages that we want to be publishing in and have relationships with. And I think the piece, so there's obviously an in-person piece of like going out, finding people, surveying them, but really trying to understand, doing that digital mapping of like where people convene digitally is the harder part, but that's where I think you get the most information. So for us, it was, getting WeChat influencers to post our survey. That was one thing that got a lot of traction, and we're able to really learn a lot from that. Figuring out what like really influential WhatsApp groups exist in the Spanish-speaking community. Who's that pastor that has, a huge WhatsApp group in his church? Who's the person who's just kind of like a block captain who has the WhatsApp group where they're just messaging everybody on the block about different things that are happening in the community, trying to get your survey into those spaces. That's the difficult work that can draw really good returns. And then I think the piece that Shawn mentioned that is really important to us is, I think listening without action can be really extractive. These are communities that get surveyed a lot. Like people are constantly putting out surveys. So if you don't come back later and say, hey, you answer these questions, here's what we did, with the information that you gave us. Here's how we're going to change what we did. I think it can be really detrimental to relationships. So really being thoughtful about what the actual outcome is going to be from the survey and how you're going to give back to people is super important.
Yeah, thanks, Mazin. And I want to just echo that, one of the things that was really important and a critical component of the work that we did is we invested, close to $300,000 in surveying, through the focus groups, the actual surveys that went out. But then that data that we used in those surveys were provided to all of our media and community partners that they then used to formulate questions for the debates that informed the town hall sessions that were happening. So people who engaged and participated in the survey saw that data coming back at them continuously throughout. The election process was featured on news stories. The Inquirer did an unpacking of the data, actually reached out to some of the survey and focus group participants to tell a little bit more in-depth stories on kind of what informed that process. And so to Mazin's point, I think that it's critically important that, when you're engaging in surveying communities, they want to see that it's actionable, that there's something that's coming out of it beyond. And even, and now as we go into this next phase and we're looking at, these are the issues that were most important, they are reflected right in the priorities of our current mayor, and now we continue the conversation, right? So we did the surveying, we asked some questions based on those surveys. We're now seeing those set up as priorities, and now let's look at the policies. But again, always going back and pointing to this is what we heard from you in the community, and now this is what we're seeing come out of that as folks set their priorities based on what you said was important.
I like to just say +1 to Mazin and Shawn, fully +1. I would give a journalistic pro tip when talking with the community, whether it's a community gathering or going to a third space and having these conversations or doing a survey. The pro tip is, what do you talk about after the survey? Or what do you talk about after the conversation? I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations about this big thing is a problem, the mayor, or something that's a policy, a national policy. And when we leave, when everybody's like, okay, have a good day, the thing everyone bonding around is caregiving, right? Because you realize, everyone has to deal with caregiving of a aging parent, for example. It's like, oh, wow, that never showed up in the survey. It's not a question I asked. It's not a question that was brought up, but then everyone's ended up talking about it at that point. So the pro tip on top of what Mazin and Shawn said is, if you're doing an event in person, mix and mingle after and just talk about what people are going up to after, what they're doing after, because you would get what really is affecting them that evening or the next morning. It's what's on their mind. It's what's keeping them up at night. That's the answer you get. So as a journalistic outlet, and when you respond to that in your journalism, that is super helpful, and it really shows that you're listening, not just being extractive as well.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much for all of that feedback. And thank you, Martha.
Thank you, Alyssa. I just want to make sure everyone knows that you lead the civic engagement work at El Puente and are also a GoVoteNYC partner. Thank you, Alyssa. The floor is open. I will jump in as I hear from anyone else. One thing that's come up a little bit, I think in mostly more positive ways than I thought would today, is social media. Oh, Pat. Oh, yes, that's where I was going, Pat. Pat says, I'm interested in hearing more about the use of influencers. What are the downsides? So could we have a little bit of discussion on influencers and social media and the pro tips on that?
Yeah, so I know for the Every Voice, Every Vote initiative, we actually engaged a company called Zomad that was kind of the manager. So they identified the social influencers that worked with us. So they were micro influencers who had at least 1,000 Philadelphia followers. They were able, through their, systems, to ensure that the followers were Philadelphia based. We had specific criteria in terms of, we're able to kind of look at their history, make sure that we were working with folks who, fit a certain profile, but then also were, we didn't dictate what they, tweeted or shared, but we also had what we called pulses, so that we provided, messaging, whether it be based on our data or help to create opinion polls and things of that nature. We had a very positive relationship, and we also had kind of a Slack channel, for lack of a better term, I think that some folks might be familiar with, where we were able to engage with the influencers, kind of talk about the feedback they were getting and the ways that they were engaging with their followers based on the work that we were doing with Every Voice, Every Vote. And it was the first time that we've worked with social media influencers as part of an initiative like this, but found it to be very rewarding. Did not have any issues in our interactions, at least so far, with our social media influence. They were actually extremely impactful for us.
Yeah, I think for a lot of folks, it's kind of like a scarier concept, just the idea of how to engage influencers. But yeah, as Shawn mentioned, it's becoming really common, especially amongst from our vantage point, like smaller nonprofit newsrooms. There's pretty well established kind of contracts and rules of engagement and transparency and ethics around how you can work with influencers to spread a message, talk about a story. It's very similar to basically hiring a freelance writer to write a piece. It's so basically engaging with an influencer to promote something that the organization is doing. We haven't actually done that from an editorial standpoint. We've engaged folks around spreading the surveys that we've been trying to do to get information about what folks are interested in. So just building genuine relationships with people who we feel like are, we don't have any issues with our brands being associated with them. I think that has been fruitful for us and hasn't really led to a lot of issues. There's just an understanding now that, folks don't fully understand. The concept of news is kind of murky for people. So they're moving through their internet, they're moving through their different social media feeds, and an influencer is 1 minute talking about, skincare routines, and then the next minute is talking about Kate Middleton and what's going on with the Princess Kate. That is news. Like, that piece of information is news. So how can you kind of interject into people's feeds in a way that's more organic, in a way that people actually get information, as opposed to previously when people they would sit down for an allotted period of time and consume news. That people don't really consume information that way anymore. So I think it is really important for us to be open to that and not be I think there's a kind of hubris that a lot of media organizations feed around connecting with influencers, but just understanding that this is a reality of where we're at. I'd say, kind of on a stepping back even further, there's an issue now that all the social media platforms have kind of de-emphasized news. That's part of the reason we're seeing this news avoidance. So Facebook, Instagram, I'm not as sure about TikTok, but definitely all of Meta's products are really de-emphasizing the amount of news that people see. And that's part of the reason we're seeing this drop off in news engagement. And that is somewhat of a crisis, I think, for news organizations. And I think a lot of people are thinking that, maybe now is a time for people to build more of that in-person engagement, more of these deep relationships, as opposed to looking for the scale that the social media platforms previously offered folks. But, things could be completely different in a year from now. So we'll see.
Yeah, I'd like to echo. Oh, so go ahead. I just want to say, yeah, just exactly what Mazin and Shawn said. A lot of people, how consumers see information, or they see media, overall, and they don't necessarily see news media as its own thing because that's not how it's fed to them, or how they curate it, just to put some ownership in the curation of news. On our end, we don't have any like deep advice for influencers when we speak with newsrooms, but we do note that when you're working with a smaller community or reporting on a smaller community, like the local doctor is an influencer, effectively, right? That's a person who's worked with that family or families in that area for 40 years. So this is not just an opportunity to get advertising necessarily, because that's sometimes how it's looked at. It's looked at from the business side, but as opposed to a distribution channel that disproportionately reaches more people in that way. So that's how we think about it. Influencers have always existed. I think we just have different names for it. So I think, as Mazin said, accepting what is the actual mechanism we're trying to tap into. It doesn't matter what the name is. Tap into that mechanism in an ethical way, and that is helpful in your feedback loop with its own limitations, as mentioned before.
Thank you. And I agree with Toya that these are really interesting comments on social media. One last question. Sandra, do you want to unmute? You sent me a message. This will be the last question and we will close.
Yes, and thank you so much for this panel. I'm so sad that I had a conflicting meeting until 11 and can't wait to listen to the recording. But my question, I think, was maybe not addressed in your panel, and it builds on the last question about social media, and it's specifically about young people and how do we reach young people with voting-focused journalism that influences engagement, particularly since so many do consume through social media. And so particularly with news being de-emphasized through the algorithms of TikTok and others. I would love to hear what your experiences have been, and also to mention one thing that we're doing actually with Mazin and the team at Documented. We have a Next Gen Civic Fellowship that do civic action projects, and they're actually partnering with Documented to look at how to bring Documented to young people, particularly immigrant young people, but also non-immigrants who are concerned with immigration. And so as an example, none of them were familiar with Documented. And when they went onto the website, they were like, where has this been all of my life? I need to read this, I need to subscribe, and I need all of my peers to do the same. But that is just like a small example that was fortuitous because I had the great pleasure of working with Mazin in the past. So on a broader scale, would love to know sort of two ways, what you've been doing with young people, and for those of us who work with young people, what can we be doing to bring more attention to the outstanding work that you and your colleagues are doing?
Yeah, so one piece, I think it goes back to what I think both Mikhael and Mazin had said before, and we talked about, is meeting people where they're at, right? And so with Every Voice, Every Vote, our election-focused initiative, we had, organizations like PA Youth Vote, which is a youth-based, initiative focused on elections and informing young people about the electoral process. We had Philly Bolt, which is a partnership or a collaboration of high school journalism programs throughout Philadelphia. We've invested in and encouraged, some of the local university newspapers to apply and become part of the process, because at the end of the day, it's about meeting young people where they're at, providing them access to, also when we sent out the survey data to all of our partners, it went to those organizations as well, and encouraging them to engage and utilize that and inform their articles. And we saw them do that in some cases. There was a youth forum that was hosted, and it was really interesting because this was the power of the coalition, where some of the candidates, opted not to, confirm at some of these town halls that some of our youth organizers were putting together, and they shared it on kind of our Every Voice, Every Vote Slack, and then the, other organizations kind of rallied behind and put some pressure on the campaigns to show up, right? And they did. But it was also just the power, because they, established that they wouldn't be ignored, right? And so they relied on their partners to exert some influence to get folks to show up, and they were able to be successful in that effort. So I think it's really about meeting folks where they are, engaging organizations that have a a standing in those communities, just like ethnic media. We need to do the same for our young people.
Yeah, I don't know if we have time, but I'll just add briefly. Yeah, really, really enjoyed been partnering with Why Vote and Next Gen Politics generally. Just the work that you all have been doing has been really impactful. And I think something that Mikhael and I have spoken about a lot actually is that there is a different product almost that you have to create when you're thinking about, multi-generational communities, like what the, more immigrants that have been here for a longer time would be interested in consuming and reading is very different to what the younger generation would be interested in reading and consuming. And it does create a complexity, I think, for news organizations to have a multi-generational appeal. And frankly, I think that as journalists who go through journalism school and different things, we're kind of trained to make journalism in this Timesian way that is, more geared towards an older demographic and doesn't engage young people in a way. So that's why I think, the work that you all are doing, and I think just generally trying to inject journalism into the lives of young people in this kind of more, one-to-one, hand-to-hand way is going to be more impactful maybe in the long term, more difficult, but more impactful in the long term than, trying to create a product that is appealing across generations, because they're almost two different products. What you would do if you were entirely focused on a teenage audience versus what you would do if you were entirely focused on an older audience. So it does create complexities for sure.
But it's also a place where like our young people are thinking about, could they create social media for documented? So maybe people aren't going to read the full articles, but can they extract certain things for a youth-facing audience? So it's an interesting possibility for partnership.
Definitely.
Thank you for that wonderful last question, and always bringing young people to the conversation, Sanda. Neil, do you want to close us out here? Oh, you've written a lot in the chat.
There we go. Thank you. Just trying to spotlight myself. Thank you so much to our panel, and Martha for your moderation, and Sandra for your intervention. I think we were able to take what can feel a very existential topic, particularly this year, media and democracy, and make it very practical and actionable. So thank you for the very specific stories and advice from our panel today. Thank you everyone who joined, and I put in the chat a little bit of information about our next learning session, which is coming up on Wednesday, May 8th. We'll be looking at ballot access and expansion for New Yorkers with criminal legal system involvement. So there's the link in the chat there if you want to go ahead and register for that. And thank you again for joining us this morning. Shawn referenced trusted messengers, and that's very much how we see the work of GoVoteNYC grantees in terms of civic engagement. And I think it's also a good term for what the media can be in this context as well. So thank you all. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone. This was great. Thank you.